Less than a month later, he was getting around on crutches thanks to Augustine's curing rituals. At each of the Tesquino gatherings, Augustine would bless the cornfields. At one of the gatherings, I participated in a ritual in which I was smudged with the smoke from a pine pitch stick, and Augustine took a knife and cut away the bad spirits that I was bound to. I then joined my new friends in a sacred but joyful prayer that they call dance. One day, Gumersindo excitedly told me that Edwin Bustillo was coming. He had talked to him on the solar-powered ham radio. I was equally excited. Now, a translator of Raramuri could answer the many questions that had been forming in my mind, and I would personally get to meet this courageous defender of Indian rights. When Edwin arrived, he was amazed at what he had heard about my communication with Augustine and my acceptance by the community, especially in light of Gumersindo's absence. After Edwin arrived, we talked. I learned that Gumersindo was the same man I had read about in the LA Times before my arrival in Mexico, part of a community effort to stop an illegal lumber contract from decimating his village. Gumersindo and many other Indians were sitting in a church near a village when narcotraficantes barged in and opened up with machine gun fire. Gumersindo's brother was killed instantly. Gumersindo was shot in the head, shoulder, and hip. After 3 months in the hospital, he was released and told he would never walk again. Edwin brought him here, and Augustine worked with him. Now, Gumersindo does not even have a limp. This slingshot was my going-away present to him, for he and I had developed a great friendship. Edwin spoke with Augustine and arranged for an interview for the following morning. At the scheduled time the following morning, Augustine did not show up, so I went to where I felt he would be and found him helping some other friends build fences out of huge 1-foot diameter burned-down logs. After an hour or so of working with him, I followed him to a clearing where we met Edwin, Alonzo, and Gumersindo, who would serve as translators. I asked many philosophical and mythological questions about Raramuri culture, and then asked Edwin to ask Augustine if he had truly been talking to me without using words. Augustine replied, "Yes, we have been talking heart to heart." I told him about the changes in my life that happened since my near-death experience on the Rio Urique 15 years previously. He told me I had gone through a place of magical power where shamans were once initiated. It would soon be time for me to leave, so I started saying goodbye to my many friends and giving whatever gifts I could. This boy had helped me learn Raramuri, so he received the tape recorder. I felt it especially important to say goodbye to the children, and it was with a child I said my final farewell to Augustine. I shared my final drink of Tesquino at a friend's house from a pot brewing corn for the next party. Just before leaving, Concha had to show me she had finally mastered the catch your ball on your shoulders game that I had taught her. True to his word, Manuel brought me a horse for the next leg of my journey. I wanted to go to an area where the Indians had chosen to remain in their caves, unlike the Indians I was living with here, who moved from their winter caves to the high country huts to escape the summer canyon heat. The caves, mostly overhangs, were scattered throughout the barrancas. Ancient pictographs like this one reveal how many generations had lived in this way. I slept one night in one of the abandoned caves and found it quite secure in spite of a rainstorm. Like their dirt-floored pine huts, the caves also all had glorious views. Indians who remain living in the caves during the summer often wear the cooler loincloths rather than the Western clothes that have been donated by charitable groups or were purchased with occasional wages earned by the Indians who work for the mestizos. Regardless of whether the Indians wore traditional Western clothing or traditional Indian clothing, all had replaced their bare feet or leather-protected feet with huaraches made of rubber tires. Some of the caves I think I could have lived in. I can see why families chose to remain here during the summer, like this one with the cornfield and beautiful river out front. As we traveled into the new region, Manuel and I came across this Indian man. We greeted him and talked briefly before he continued on his way. As he passed me, he looked at me carefully, and once again I felt a message enter my psyche. "Ah, so we will talk again," it said. Shocked by this communication, I turned and quickly shot this photo. We continued onward, stopping at various rancheros for last-minute research observations. At this cave home, I photographed an innovative idea for feeding horses and burros. Corn stalks had been tossed into the tree to keep them away from wild animals and would be dropped as needed to feed the horses. The girls in this vicinity were equally shy and frightened, but I managed to catch this shot before this little one ducked out of sight. This hut was built out as a cave extension. Here we came across a girl herding goats, but when she saw us, she ran and hid. Each time Manuel and I rode up to a ranchero, we were offered food, in spite of the fact that these people had very little of it to share. The day before we were to return to Agua Azul, we stopped at this beautiful ranchero, and I watched the woman making yarn from wool. To my amazement, the woman was the wife of the man that had communicated to me telepathically on the trail. His name was Sevillano. Manuel had told me of a hot springs in the area, and I craved a bath. He made arrangements with Sevillano to show me where the springs were, about an hour away. Sevillano and I walked in silence for about an hour. Then we came upon a man carrying a rifle and looking very concerned about my presence. I felt sure we must be near a marijuana or poppy field, and had I not been with Sevillano, I feel I would have been shot. I bathed in the warm water, and Sevillano spoke to me again telepathically. His message seemed to complement the wisdom shared with me by Augustine. We laughed long and hard as I had to make a dozen trips in and out of the water before he managed to figure out how to use the camera to sufficiently click this photo. When we returned to where Manuel was waiting for us, I asked Manuel if Sevillano was an Raramuri, a shaman. He said, yes, very big, almost as big as Augustine. We left the canyon and returned to Agua Azul. Back at Edwin's father's house in Agua Azul, I had a Mexican meal of fried cow intestines and sipped tea with Edwin's father, waiting for Edwin to arrive for our next adventure. When I had first arrived in Chihuahua, Mexico, Randy told me of a man named Romain Wheeler. Romain knew much about the Raramuri spirituality, and like Edwin Bustillo, had devoted most of his life to helping them retain their culture. He and Edwin knew of one another, but had never actually met. I wanted to introduce them. Edwin agreed that he would like to meet Romain, and we headed off for the canyons near Creel, where Romain lived. Traveling with Edwin felt risky, as we were without his bodyguard. Once we were pulled over by the federales and told to put our hands on the car, and I was worried. Fortunately, it was another routine effort at showmanship. Edwin told them he was a Mexican citizen and would not put his hands on the car. When I took this photo, they asked me why. Edwin said it was a free country, and we drove off. Romain Wheeler is a concert pianist who had been studying Native American music when he came upon the Raramuri. In 1981, after his brother miraculously survived a bout with cancer, Romain moved to a cave deep in the canyons near Creel and played his music for the Indians on a solar-powered keyboard. He knew of Edwin Bustillo's efforts in behalf of the Indians and was truly honored to meet him. He became friends with a shaman who helped him learn the Raramuri culture and the language. He eventually built a house above where his cave is, shown in this picture. This is an ancient pictograph that was located in the cave Romain lived in. Here in the home he built above the cave, Romain writes music inspired by the Indians he has come to think of as family. Unfortunately, like much of the Copper Canyon area, his beautiful view may soon be blighted by a mining operation rumored for across the valley. In the meantime, he plays his inspired music for the people and travels 3 months a year giving concerts throughout Europe to raise money for them. Like Edwin, he tries his best to prevent the well-intentioned missionaries from destroying the Raramuri culture. After an incredible evening of talking and listening to Romain's music, we prepared to leave. I shot this photo of one of the Indians who sat outside his cabin, looking over the ridge in meditation from dawn until dusk. Visiting Romain's original cave home one last time, I thought about the shaman Romain told me about. I wanted to meet him, but knew he lived down into the canyon, and it would not be likely. Then, almost magically, the shaman appeared just as we were about to leave. Before either Edwin or Romain realized it, I stepped outside, greeted him, asked his permission for this photo, then said goodbye. We did not talk, but we connected. On the way out along the rugged mountain road that led for 7 hours to Romain's, we came upon a logging truck. It reminded us of what was happening to these beautiful and wise people in their incredible land. When Edwin and I reached civilization near Creel, we saw a newspaper article about an event that had just occurred on May 23rd in Chihuahua. A group of Indians had walked for days from Urique to protest the governor's allowance of illegal logging and poppy fields in their community. In February of 1995, 15 of these Indians had been murdered and no one was arrested for the murders. As they gathered near the governor's office in the city of Chihuahua, the police moved in, killing one man and wounding others. Edwin dropped me off in Creel and continued on to his office in Chihuahua. I had 5 days left and was determined to return to where I had almost been killed on the Rio Urique in 1983. I wanted to take pictures of the infamous hole that had started my strange spiritual journey and my involvement with the Raramuri. I had a photo of the man who had saved my life and also wanted to meet him, again if possible, and thank him. From Creel, I took the second-class train to El Divisadero. A contact named Lincho Mancinas was there to meet me. He would be able to lead me back to the hole that had almost taken my life. When I talked to him, he said, however, it would take 2 or 3 days. I only had 5. He said, well, an Indian guide could take me down in 8 hours, but didn't think I was in shape to do it. I opted for the Indian guide and went for the most difficult run of my life. We climbed down 40-foot-long poles that were notched, barely resting on ledges with 1,000-foot drop-offs. In 10 hours, we arrived at the place. The water was much lower and the cave looked different than it had when I went through it in 1983. It was catacombed with chambers that were dead-ended. If indeed this had been a shaman initiation, the candidate, struggling, would move himself out of the current of the main flow and be forced against a dead end and drown. As I looked at the cave, I looked up and saw a man. I walked up to him and brought the photo out, asking him if he knew the Indian that had once saved my life. Then realized this was the Indian. He smiled at me, and in typical Raramuri fashion, showed no emotion. I sat next to him and noticed the wool sweater I had given him, now cut down the middle and sewn with black wool. We sat for a moment. He got up, and then telepathically said to me, "What are you going to do with the power?" Instantly, I replied back, "I will tell the world about your story."
aho ne warula komir si te vela gochili we kolavar hari no avokura komir